In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the Simmons family lived what seemed to be a typical everyday life. Rachel Simmons, a 22-year-old single mother, had a 1-year-old daughter, Lily, whom she adored more than anything in the world. Despite the challenges that came with being a young mother, Rachel managed to maintain a sense of normalcy in her life. She spent her days caring for Lily, ensuring that she had everything she needed, from food to clothes to attention. Life was far from perfect, but it was manageable, and Rachel had learned to find joy in the little things, like watching her daughter take her first steps or hearing her laugh for the first time. However, Rachel's life began to change when she met Kyle. Kyle was a 16-year-old high school student who, at first glance, seemed charming and gentle. He was friendly, often offering to help Rachel with small tasks around the house. He would spend hours talking with her, listening to her stories about motherhood and offering advice, though his advice often felt like it came from a place of wanting to control rather than to help. For Rachel, Kyle was a breath of fresh air, a young man who seemed to understand her, someone who could fill the gaps that were left by the absence of a father figure in Lily's life. Rachel began spending more time with Kyle, and soon, their relationship blossomed. He started spending weekends at her house, helping with Lily, playing with her, and even changing diapers. On the surface, it appeared that Kyle was a loving, responsible young man who cared deeply about Rachel and her daughter, but underneath the surface, there were signs of something darker, signs that Rachel either ignored or didn't recognize. Kyle's temper, though rare, was something that would sometimes surface in subtle ways. When things didn't go according to his plan, he would become irritated, sometimes snapping at Rachel or making offhand comments that seemed to come out of nowhere. Rachel, too enamored by Kyle's attention, would brush off these incidents, believing them to be one-off moments of frustration. But those closest to Rachel began to notice the small changes in Kyle's behavior. His moods swinging unpredictably, his shortness with Rachel, and his need to control situations that were beyond his reach. Neighbors occasionally caught glimpses of the tension when Kyle would be out in the yard, arguing with Rachel over something insignificant. Yet Rachel would always reassure them, saying that it was just a minor disagreement and that everything was fine. She believed she could handle the situation, that it was just a phase, and that her love for Kyle would help him work through whatever personal struggles he was facing. Despite the growing discomfort from those around her, Rachel's attachment to Kyle grew stronger. She believed that Kyle's presence in their home would provide stability for Lily, someone to help guide and protect her. The couple seemed inseparable, and for a while, Rachel felt like they were a family. Kyle became a fixture in their daily lives, and Rachel began to rely on him more and more for emotional support. She even started to see him as a potential father figure for Lily, someone who could step into the role that Lily's own father had never filled. But what Rachel couldn't see was that Kyle's charm had a darker side. He began isolating Rachel from her friends and family, making subtle remarks that planted seeds of doubt about the people who cared for her. Kyle slowly became the center of her world, and Rachel failed to notice the red flags that were becoming increasingly apparent. To the outside world, they were just a young couple trying to make their relationship work, but behind closed doors, the signs of trouble were growing. The day that would forever alter the course of Rachel's life began like any other. She woke up early to tend to Lily, feeding her, changing her, and preparing for a busy day ahead. Rachel had errands to run, and as usual, Kyle was there, offering to help out in any way he could. Kyle had been spending more and more time at the house, and Rachel had come to rely on his presence. He was always there when she needed him, helping with little things around the house and keeping Lily entertained. Though there were moments when Rachel felt uneasy about Kyle's increasing control over their lives, she brushed those feelings aside, thinking that he was simply trying to be a good partner. That morning, Rachel kissed Lily goodbye as she left to run a few errands. Kyle stayed behind, as he often did, watching over Lily. She trusted him implicitly. It seemed like everything would be fine, like it always had been. The errands didn't take long, and Rachel was in a good mood, thinking about how she'd spend the rest of the day with Kyle and Lily. However, as she returned home, the atmosphere in the house felt different. The door was slightly ajar, and the house was unnervingly silent. Rachel's stomach turned as she stepped inside, calling out for Kyle. There was no answer. It wasn't until she reached the living room that she saw Lily lying on the floor, motionless. The horror that washed over Rachel in that moment was indescribable. Her heart raced as she rushed to her daughter's side, but the worst reality she could have imagined was already unfolding before her eyes. Lily's body was cold, her small frame bruised in places Rachel couldn't comprehend. The room was eerily still, the only sound Rachel's frantic breathing. She screamed Lily's name, but there was no response. Kyle was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as Rachel fumbled for her phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. When the authorities arrived, they quickly moved to assess the situation, but the damage had already been done. They took one look at Lily's body and immediately recognized signs of something far worse than a simple accident. The bite marks on Lily's arms and legs were disturbing, and the bruises on her tiny body suggested a violent struggle. Something had happened to her, something terrible. The first responders noted the irregularities of the scene, and it quickly became clear that Lily hadn't died of natural causes. The police began their investigation, and Rachel was overwhelmed with shock and disbelief. How could this have happened? She had left Kyle alone with Lily many times before, and nothing had ever gone wrong. The thought that anyone, especially Kyle, could harm her precious daughter was too much to process. As the scene was carefully examined, they began to question Rachel, asking about her relationship with Kyle, his behavior, and any signs of trouble that might have indicated something was wrong. Rachel could only think of the good things, the way Kyle had been so helpful, the way he'd smiled at Lily, the way he'd promised to take care of her. She couldn't reconcile the image of the young man she knew with the brutality she was now faced with. Kyle, meanwhile, had disappeared. No one knew where he had gone, and his sudden absence made Rachel even more frantic. She could hardly comprehend that the person she had welcomed into their lives could be responsible for something so horrific. As detectives pieced together the timeline of events, it became evident that something sinister had taken place in that seemingly quiet, ordinary home. The investigation was just beginning, and though Rachel was still in shock, she knew deep down that the life she thought she had built with Kyle had been shattered in a way she could never have imagined. The investigation into Lily's death quickly took a dark turn as authorities began to examine the crime scene more closely. What initially seemed like a tragic accident was becoming something far more sinister. Rachel, still in shock, was questioned by detectives about the events leading up to her daughter's death. She struggled to make sense of the situation, her mind clouded with grief and disbelief. How could her daughter, who had been healthy and full of life just hours ago, now be gone? And how could Kyle, someone she had trusted so completely, be involved in something so monstrous? As detectives combed through the house for clues, They found details that raised serious concerns. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to have been stolen. Lily's body, though, told a different story. The bite marks on her limbs, the bruises, and the abrasions indicated a brutal and deliberate attack. It wasn't just an accident or a simple injury. It was a violent act. The forensic team took photographs, made notes, and began to gather evidence that would later be crucial in unraveling the mystery of what had truly happened. One of the most shocking discoveries came when the authorities started looking into Kyle's whereabouts. He had vanished without a trace, and no one could figure out where he had gone. The police quickly realized that Kyle had been the last person to see Lily alive, and his sudden disappearance was more than suspicious. Rachel, still reeling from the loss of her daughter, was unable to give much information about his whereabouts or his actions that day. She could barely comprehend the reality of the situation, and her mind was a haze of confusion and panic. It didn't take long for investigators to uncover disturbing details about Kyle's past. He had a history of violent outbursts, though no one had ever taken them seriously. Friends and family members who had seen him interact with Rachel, and Lily noticed that he could be erratic at times, but no one had ever imagined he was capable of something as horrific as what had happened to Lily. Kyle's relationships with those around him were often marked by tension. He had a history of anger management issues, something that had been brushed aside by Rachel as part of his teenage years. Detectives went through Kyle's phone records, searching for any trace of information that might explain his sudden rage. What they found was chilling. Kyle had spent time researching ways to control children, to manage their behavior, and disturbingly, ways to deal with annoying kids. It was clear that his attitude toward children, especially Lily, was far from the caring, gentle figure Rachel had believed him to be. The research he had done seemed to suggest that he saw Lily as more of a burden than a child he cared for. As the investigation deepened, the police were able to gather more evidence that pointed directly to Kyle. His dental impressions matched the bite marks found on Lily's body. It was a horrifying realization, and the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together in a way that Rachel never could have imagined. Kyle wasn't just a teenager who had lost control. He had intentionally harmed Lily. The brutality of his actions stunned everyone, especially Rachel, who had never suspected that Kyle was capable of such violence. Meanwhile, Kyle remained on the run, and the police launched an intense manhunt to find him. Rachel, torn between grief and a sense of betrayal, struggled with the reality of the situation. The man she had loved, the boy who had been so kind to her and her daughter, was now the prime suspect in her child's death. She couldn't reconcile the person she thought she knew with the monster that the investigation was revealing. The more the police uncovered about Kyle's past, the clearer it became that he had been hiding something far more dangerous beneath his calm facade. Rachel was left in an agonizing position, unsure of how she had missed the signs or what had gone wrong. The truth was slowly emerging, and it was one that no one, especially Rachel, could have ever prepared for. As the investigation into Kyle's involvement in Lily's death unfolded, more and more unsettling details about his past began to surface. It became clear that the teenager Rachel had welcomed into her home was not the caring, gentle person he had appeared to be. The police dug deep into Kyle's background, uncovering a pattern of violent behavior that had been ignored or overlooked by those around him. It was as though he had been hiding a darker side, one that Rachel, blinded by her attachment to him, had failed to see. Kyle had always been a troubled young man. Raised in a broken home, he had struggled with feelings of abandonment and anger. His relationship with his own family was strained, with a history of conflict between him and his parents. Reports surfaced that he had been in and out of trouble at school, involved in fights, and showing an increasing lack of respect for authority figures. He had been sent to counseling at a young age for anger management issues, but it seemed that the treatment had done little to address the deeper issues within him. Those who knew him described a young man who could be charming and charismatic, but whose temper flared easily when things didn't go his way. Rachel, despite hearing murmurs of Kyle's past, chose to ignore the warning signs. She believed that he was trying to make a fresh start, that his difficult childhood had shaped him, but that he was working to move beyond it. She told herself that his occasional outbursts were nothing more than normal teenage frustration, something all young people went through. But as the investigation progressed, it became apparent that Kyle's issues ran much deeper than she had ever realized. His relationship with her was one of control, manipulation, and secrecy, not love and support, as she had convinced herself. Detectives soon uncovered that Kyle had spent a significant amount of time researching methods to handle children, particularly those who were difficult or annoying. What was even more disturbing was that his research had taken a darker turn. He had searched online for ways to deal with unruly kids, including violent methods to assert dominance. This was not the behavior of someone who wanted to help care for a child. It was the behavior of someone who saw children as objects to be controlled, something to dominate rather than protect. Kyle's internet history revealed that his feelings toward children were not what Rachel had believed them to be. The more investigators dug into his actions in the days leading up to Lily's death, the more sinister patterns emerged. Kyle had been spending increasing amounts of time alone with Lily, and it became clear that his behavior had been escalating. Witnesses who had seen him interact with the baby described an air of impatience and even cruelty during their interactions. One neighbor recalled hearing Kyle raise his voice at Lily when she cried, his patience wearing thin in ways that no one had expected. Kyle's escalating frustration with Lily, whom he seemed to view as a nuisance, was not an isolated event. His actions had been carefully hidden behind the facade of a loving boyfriend and a helpful young man. But the violence that had once been concealed beneath his calm exterior had finally erupted in the most horrifying way imaginable. As detectives pieced together the timeline of the tragic day, they realized that Kyle had been the one to end Lily's life. The bite marks found on her small body matched Kyle's dental impressions. The brutality of his actions shocked even the seasoned investigators who had seen their fair share of violent crimes. Kyle had not just harmed Lily in a fit of rage. He had bitten her in multiple places, leaving marks that were impossible to ignore. This was not a momentary loss of control. It was an intentional act of cruelty. Meanwhile, Kyle remained missing, a fugitive on the run. His disappearance added to the growing sense of urgency in the case, and police knew that finding him was a matter of time. But Rachel, left in a state of shock and disbelief, could not grasp the full scope of the situation. The man she had welcomed into her home, the young man she had trusted with her daughter, was a killer. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, leaving her consumed by a mixture of guilt, confusion, and grief. She could not understand how she had allowed herself to be blinded by love and trust, all while the man she had believed to be her partner had been capable of such a horrifying act. As the search for Kyle intensified, the truth about his dark past and the violence he had concealed began to take shape. Rachel was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered life, questioning everything she had believed about her relationship and the safety of her daughter. The investigation was far from over, But the chilling truth was already clear. Kyle was a dangerous individual, and his actions had destroyed the life of an innocent child. As the investigation into Kyle's role in Lily's death continued, the community was left reeling from the sheer horror of the crime. No one could believe that a young man who had been so charming, so seemingly innocent, could be capable of such violence. For Rachel, the emotional toll was unbearable. She found herself trapped in a whirlwind of emotions: grief for the loss of her daughter, guilt for not seeing the signs, and a profound sense of betrayal. The realization that Kyle, the person she had trusted and loved, was responsible for her daughter's death, left her in a state of disbelief. How could she have been so blind to the growing danger in their home? The search for Kyle intensified as law enforcement officials combed through every lead, but the young man had vanished. Despite the heavy police presence and the media frenzy surrounding the case, Kyle was nowhere to be found. Authorities believed he had gone into hiding, but they were determined to track him down. Rachel, in her devastated state, had no answers to offer. She was consumed with the question that haunted her day and night. How had she failed to see the monster that Kyle had become? Days turned into weeks, and Rachel's emotional and mental state began to deteriorate. She couldn't escape the guilt that gnawed at her. If she had just paid closer attention, if she had noticed the warning signs, could she have stopped Kyle before it was too late? She replayed every moment with Kyle, every interaction, every warning that had been ignored. She wished she could go back, to undo the decisions that had led to this horrific outcome. But there was no going back, and the reality of her situation began to sink in. Kyle wasn't just someone she had loved. He was a murderer, and he had taken away her precious daughter. As the weeks passed, the case began to grab national attention. People everywhere were shocked by the brutality of the crime, and many questioned how something so horrific could have happened in a seemingly quiet suburban home. News outlets speculated on Kyle's whereabouts, and his image was plastered across every television screen. Despite the widespread coverage, Kyle remained elusive, slipping further and further away from the authorities' grasp. The police were determined to bring him to justice, but with each passing day, the hope of finding him alive seemed to fade. Then, out of nowhere, a breakthrough came. Kyle's location was finally tracked to a small town several hundred miles away. Authorities swooped in, surrounding the location where he had been hiding. He had been living under a false identity, trying to escape the guilt of his actions. When the police apprehended him, he was disoriented and shaken. But there was no denying the horror he had inflicted. Kyle was arrested and brought into custody, his future uncertain. The moment he was taken into custody marked the beginning of a long and painful journey for Rachel and her family, who were left to pick up the shattered pieces of their lives. The trial that followed was a painful reminder of the depths of Kyle's cruelty. His defense team argued that he had been a troubled teenager, a victim of his circumstances, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The bite marks on Lily's body, the forensic evidence, and the disturbing details uncovered during the investigation all pointed to one undeniable truth. Kyle had murdered Lily in a fit of rage, an act of violence that had been years in the making. As the case went to trial, Rachel struggled to come to terms with the reality that the young man she had once trusted was a killer. In the end, Kyle was convicted of first-degree murder. The sentence was a small consolation to Rachel, who would never be able to bring her daughter back. As the courtroom cleared and the case was closed, Rachel was left with nothing but the memories of a child who had been taken far too soon. The community, too, was left to grapple with the aftermath of the tragedy, struggling to understand how someone they had once seen as a friend and neighbor could commit such an unspeakable act. For Rachel, the pain would never fully subside. She would carry the weight of her loss for the rest of her life, and though Kyle was now behind bars, the emotional scars of what had happened would haunt her forever. The death of her daughter had shattered her world in ways she could never have imagined, and as the years passed, Rachel would have to find a way to live with the haunting question that would never leave her. How could she have ever trusted Kyle?